September 1944, Eastern France. A 23-year-old former auto mechanic from Cleveland is sitting inside a Sherman tank, and he is doing the math nobody wants to do. His name is Eddie Kowalski. He fixes Chevrolets. Or he used to, before the war swallowed him whole. Now he sits behind the controls of a machine that weighs 33 tons and has armor so thin that the Germans have a nickname for what happens when their shells meet it. They call it Tommy cooking. The Americans call it something worse. Down the road, German intelligence has parked 92 Tiger tanks directly across Patton's line of advance. Each one weighs 56 tons. Each one carries an 88mm cannon that can punch through Eddie's Sherman from over a mile away, at a range where Eddie's own gun might as well be throwing gravel. The math is not complicated. One Tiger, on average, destroys 4 Shermans before it goes down. 92 Tigers means roughly 370 Shermans and something in the neighborhood of 1,500 American lives, if everything goes the way the Germans are counting on. German High Command is betting the Western Front on this single deployment. Stop Patton. Buy time. Let the Third Army bleed out in the fields of Eastern France while reinforcements rush toward the Rhine. On paper, it should have worked. On paper, Eddie Kowalski and thousands of men exactly like him should be dead by the end of the week. They aren't. When the smoke settles 72 hours later, fewer than 5 Tigers are still operational. The rest are burning, abandoned, or blown apart in pieces across the French countryside. And a mechanic from Cleveland, who has never read a single page of military tactical doctrine, played a role that war colleges are still pulling apart today. To understand how a man who spent his life listening to misfiring Chevrolet engines helped destroy the most feared armored weapon in the Second World War, you have to start with what was happening to Germany by the summer of 1944, because by then things had gone very, very wrong. The Allied landings at Normandy cracked open the door. What came after blew it off the hinges. For weeks the fighting in the hedgerow country had been a suffocating grind, yards traded for blood, American divisions suffering turnover rates in their rifle companies that commanders could barely bring themselves to write down. Then on July 25th, Operation Cobra exploded through German lines west of St. Lo, and through that hole came Patton. There is no more precise way to say this. Patton did not advance across France. He detonated across it. His tank columns covered 30, 40, 50 miles in a single day. German divisions that were supposed to form defensive lines found themselves encircled before they could dig a single foxhole. Officers who had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, men who considered themselves experts on armored shock, said privately that Patton moved faster and with more disorientation than anything the Red Army had ever produced. In August alone, the German army in the West lost more than 300,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Staff officers at German headquarters were moving map pins so fast the maps became obsolete before the ink dried. Patton's Third Army captured more territory in 2 weeks than the entire Allied force had managed in the 2 months since D-Day. Something had to be done, something that couldn't be flanked or outrun. Something with 56 tons of steel and an 88mm gun capable of killing at a mile. They needed the Tiger, and they deployed 92 of them in what they called Operation Eisenhammer, Iron Hammer. The plan was elegant in its brutality. 3 defensive lines staggered across the most likely avenues of American advance. The first line bleeds the leading armor. The second line catches whatever breaks through. The third line counterattacks any flanking attempt. German planners estimated it would take Patton's forces at least 2 weeks to breach all 3, 2 weeks during which the Reich could stabilize, reinforce, fortify. What those planners had not accounted for was a man sitting in a Sherman tank with an oil-stained notebook in his coveralls. Eddie Kowalski had first seen Tigers in combat near Mortain in early August during the German counterattack. He watched from 800 yards as a single Tiger destroyed 3 Shermans from his company in under 2 minutes. The shells passed through those tanks like they were made of paper. Crews burned alive. Eddie's own tank survived only because his commander ordered a retreat behind a hedgerow before the Tiger's turret could swing around to finish the job. That night, Eddie couldn't sleep. But what kept him awake wasn't pure fear, though there was plenty of that too. It was something more specific. It was the mechanic in him, the part that had spent years listening to engines, that kept turning the problem over and over like a cylinder that wasn't firing right. He had noticed things, the way the Tiger moved, how slowly it repositioned, how the engine note changed when it shifted gears across soft ground, how long it took the enormous turret to track a fast-moving target, and something clicked, the same kind of click he felt when he finally isolated a bad valve lifter back in Cleveland. Not inspiration, recognition. The Tiger was powerful, yes. It was also a mechanical nightmare. Eddie started asking questions. He talked to other tank crews who had survived Tiger engagements, collecting data points the way a doctor collects symptoms. How long did the turret take to complete a full rotation? About 60 seconds compared to 15 for a Sherman. How quickly could a Tiger accelerate? Barely at all. It went from standing to speed like a freight train, all mass and almost no urgency. What happened to a Tiger on soft ground? It sank. The thing weighed so much that even its wide tracks couldn't save it from mud. Where was the armor thinnest? The sides, roughly 80 millimeters, less than half the front plate. The rear was thinner still. He wrote all of it down in a small notebook he carried in his coveralls. His tank commander, Lieutenant James Morrison from Virginia, noticed what he was doing and didn't tell him to stop. He started adding his own observations. Other crew commanders joined in. Within days, Eddie's notebook had become something it was never meant to be, an unofficial tactical manual assembled by men who had faced Tigers in combat and lived to describe what they saw. When Captain Robert Hayes saw it, he didn't laugh. He took it straight to battalion command. Battalion took it to division. Division took it to 3rd Army headquarters, because what Eddie Kowalski had produced, without training, without doctrine, without a single course in military strategy, was confirmation of everything Patton had been preaching for months. The Tiger could be beaten, not by building a better tank, but by understanding what broke it and going after those breaks relentlessly. Not everyone was convinced. Colonel Harold Brennan commanded the armored regiment that included Eddie's company. West Point, class of 1928. North Africa, Kasserine, Sicily, Normandy. He had bled for those credentials, and he was not remotely interested in having a corporal mechanic explain armored warfare to him. When Captain Hayes brought the notebook up the chain, Brennan's reaction could be felt through the walls of his command post. He had lost 14 tanks at Kasserine, he told Hayes. He knew what Tigers could do, and what Tigers could do was kill Shermans. The answer was concentration of force and disciplined fire and maneuver, not whatever cowboy philosophy Patton's headquarters was cooking up. His objection wasn't irrational. Kasserine had been a catastrophe of piecemeal aggression. Brennan had watched men die because officers rushed forward without coordination. Every instinct he had developed over 2 years of combat was telling him that accelerating into 92 Tigers was a death wish dressed up as a strategy. He ordered Hayes to shelve the notebook. Standard doctrine would be followed. Eddie heard about the decision from Morrison that evening. He sat with it for a while. He thought about the men in his tank, the men in his company, the men who would be the first vehicles over the next rise. If Brennan sent them straight up the main road in a neat column toward 92 guns that could see them coming from a mile away. Then he went to see Major Thomas Whitfield. Whitfield was the regiment's operations officer, an MIT engineering student turned soldier, 31 years old, a man who understood machines and systems and the cold logic of what happens when a bad plan meets reality. He had already been quietly reading the same intelligence that informed Patton's anti-Tiger guidelines, and Captain Hayes had slipped Eddie's notebook onto his desk 3 days earlier with a note that read simply, "The mechanic sees what we're missing." Whitfield had verified every data point. The turret traverse rate matched the intelligence reports. The fuel consumption figures matched captured German logistics documents. The mechanical reliability estimates aligned with after-action reports from units that had recovered disabled Tigers. When Eddie showed up at his tent that night, Whitfield was already working. The plan they developed kept the skeleton of Brennan's advance, but rewired its logic. Scouts would identify Tiger positions before the main force committed. Artillery would be pre-registered on likely Tiger positions, ready to fire within 90 seconds of contact. Tank destroyers would move to the flanks, not in the main column, positioned for side shots the moment Tigers revealed themselves. And no single company would advance alone across open ground. If one unit drew fire, adjacent companies would immediately move to flank. The problem was that implementing this required Brennan's approval, and Brennan had made his position clear. Whitfield made a decision that could have ended his career. He contacted 3rd Army headquarters directly, bypassing Brennan, and requested that a representative from Patton's staff attend the morning briefing. The request was granted. Lieutenant Colonel David Abrams, one of Patton's most trusted tactical advisors, would be there. The briefing on September 12th was as tense as briefings get. Brennan presented his plan. Abrams listened, then laid out 3rd Army intelligence on the German deployment without ever directly criticizing the man standing next to him. 3 lines of Tigers. Prepared positions with pre-registered kill zones. Infantry support covering every gap. Estimated time to breach the first line under Brennan's plan, 8 to 12 hours. Estimated American tank losses during that breach, 40 to 60% of the leading battalion. Under Patton's preferred approach, multiple axes, combined arms, relentless tempo, breach time dropped to 4 to 6 hours. Losses dropped to 15 to 25%. Brennan argued back. Perfect coordination didn't exist in combat. Radios failed, smoke obscured targets, men panicked. Mass wins battles. Abrams nodded. Mass wins battles when the enemy is dispersed. When the enemy is concentrated in prepared positions with the most powerful tank gun in the world, mass gives them a target-rich environment. Then he made clear, politely but unmistakably, that these were not suggestions. They were orders from 3rd Army Command. Brennan accepted the modified plan. He pulled Whitfield aside afterward and made one thing perfectly clear. If this goes wrong, the mechanic's stripes and your career are what pays for it, not mine. Whitfield didn't flinch. He had 16 hours to prepare for the largest Tiger engagement any American unit had ever faced. The morning of September 13th broke gray and cool, with fog sitting in the valleys like something that had decided to stay. The fog was a gift. At less than 500 yards of visibility, the Tiger's greatest advantage, its ability to kill at extreme range, was temporarily blinded. First contact came at 0647. Scout teams reported Tiger positions along a ridgeline approximately 1,200 yards ahead. At least 8 Tigers, hull down, turrets just above the terrain, guns pointed directly down the main approach road. A column of Shermans advancing up that road would have been visible to all 8 simultaneously. 8 Tigers firing every 8 seconds, over 45 seconds of unobstructed fire before the Shermans could close to any range that mattered. Instead, the lead company stopped short of the ridge. Artillery coordinates went out. Within 3 minutes, 105mm shells began falling on the Tiger positions, not to punch through armor, but to force crews to button up their hatches and lose the external visibility they needed to aim accurately at range. Simultaneously, Eddie's company and 2 others peeled off the main road, pushing through muddy farm lanes barely wide enough for a tank, branches scraping hull, visibility down to 200 yards, and falling. At 0712, Eddie's company came out of a tree line 600 yards to the left flank of the Tiger position. 600 yards. At that range, the Tiger's side armor was vulnerable. More importantly, every turret on that ridge was facing the wrong direction, pointed down the main road where artillery was still falling. Morrison gave the fire order. 5 Shermans opened up simultaneously on exposed flanks. Eddie felt his tank rock with the recoil. Through his periscope, he watched a flash bloom against the side of the nearest Tiger, then another. The Tiger's turret began to traverse toward them. That slow grinding rotation, 60 seconds for a full rotation. They had 60 seconds. In those 60 seconds, Eddie's company fired 23 rounds. 4 Tigers were hit from the side. Two began to smoke. One exploded as the ammunition inside cooked off. The fourth had its track shattered and sat there immobilized, suddenly very loud and very still. P-47. Thunderbolts arrived as the fog broke enough for air operations. Rockets and 500-pound bombs fell on the German positions. Two more Tigers were hit from above, one taking a direct rocket strike to the engine deck that left it burning with the crew running for their lives. Tank destroyers that had swung even wider than Eddie's company appeared on the Tigers' right flank. M18 Hellcats, fast and lightly armored, but mounting 76mm guns that could reach Tiger side armor at combat range. They fired and moved, never staying in one position long enough for a Tiger to swing its gun around and answer. 90 minutes after first contact, 11 of the estimated 15 Tigers in the first defensive line were destroyed, immobilized, or abandoned. American losses: 4 Shermans destroyed, 2 damaged. The ratio that was supposed to be 4 Shermans per Tiger had been inverted, almost exactly inverted. Watching from his command half-track, Colonel Brennan said nothing for a long time. Then he picked up the radio and called Whitfield. The mechanic's information was correct about the traverse rate. What else does he know about their second line? It was the closest thing to an apology Eddie Kowalski would ever receive. Patton's headquarters received the report within the hour and responded with a single sentence. Do not stop. Repeat, do not stop. They didn't stop. But what was waiting past the first line was something different. German General Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded tanks under Rommel in North Africa and understood better than most that clinging to failing doctrine was just a polite way of dying, convened an emergency meeting with his surviving Tiger Company commanders within hours of the first line's collapse. His signals unit had intercepted fragments of American radio traffic during the engagement. They heard the coordination. They heard references to Tiger vulnerabilities. They heard the system working. Bayerlein's new orders were radical by German standards. Abandon the remaining 2 defensive lines. Break the Tigers into teams of 2 or 3. Move them into villages, forests, urban areas, anywhere that American air power couldn't operate effectively, and where artillery risked killing French civilians and destroying infrastructure the Americans would need. Fight close, ambush and withdraw. Never hold a position longer than 30 minutes. Use the Tiger's massive gun at point-blank range, down narrow streets where a single shot could destroy multiple vehicles. It was the opposite of everything Tiger crews were trained to do. It was also brilliant. Within 12 hours, 60 operational Tigers had vanished from their defensive positions. American scouts found the second and third lines abandoned. For a brief, dangerous moment, American commanders thought the Germans were retreating. They were not retreating. The first ambush came at the village of Montclair. A column of 6 Shermans advanced through the main street, infantry screening ahead, tanks following in file. The lead Sherman reached the village square. A Tiger was hidden inside a partially collapsed barn, its barrel protruding 3 feet past the rubble. Range, 80 yards. At 80 yards, the 88mm round passed through the front armor of the lead Sherman, through the engine compartment, and out the rear plate. The Sherman behind it took a round through the turret before the crew identified where the shot had come from. The Tiger reversed out of the barn, crushed the rear wall going backward, and disappeared into an alley before tank destroyers could respond. 2 Shermans destroyed. 0 damage to the Tiger. Total elapsed time, 45 seconds. 3 more ambushes followed that afternoon. A Tiger behind a farmhouse. 2 Tigers at opposite ends of a crossroads, creating a crossfire. A single Tiger in a sunken lane that fired into the side of a passing column and then withdrew into woods like it had never been there. By evening, 8 American tanks were destroyed, 3 damaged, and not a single Tiger lost. Morale dropped. Overconfidence from the first engagement, the feeling that Tigers were now just a solvable tactical problem, evaporated in the smoke rising from burning Shermans. Some company commanders had stopped calling for artillery support, stopped waiting for air cover, pushed into unscouted terrain because speed and flanking had worked before. It didn't work in villages where the hunter had chosen the ground. One of the men killed at Montclair was Corporal James Dunning, Eddie's former loader, transferred to another crew just 2 days before to replace a wounded man. Eddie found out over the radio and sat in his driver's seat without speaking for an hour. Colonel Brennan, who had reversed his position after the first engagement, now used the mounting casualties to reverse it again. He sent a report to division headquarters recommending the regiment halt and consolidate and wait for reinforcements before continuing. The report included the casualty figures. Division forwarded it to 3rd Army. For 12 hours, there was silence. Some officers blamed Eddie's notebook for creating the overconfidence that led to the ambush losses. If the first engagement hadn't looked so easy, the argument went, crews would have stayed careful. If the tactics hadn't worked so cleanly against the defensive lines, commanders wouldn't have gotten reckless in terrain those tactics were never designed for. Eddie sat with that too. 3 men were dead. James Dunning was dead. Then Patton responded. Not through staff channels, directly over the command net, in clear language that every radio operator in the regiment could hear. Tigers hiding in villages means tigers have abandoned the open ground. They gave up their defensive lines. They are reacting to us. We do not stop because the enemy adapts. We adapt faster. The new orders that followed became a case study in military institutions that teach armored warfare to this day. Patton's staff had analyzed the ambush pattern in real time. Tigers in villages depended on narrow streets and buildings for concealment. They operated in small teams. They fired and ran. The weakness was movement. A tiger reversing through a village was slow, loud, and visible, and once it fired, it could no longer hide. And it couldn't reposition faster than a radio signal could transmit its location. The plan was precise. Every infantry squad moving through a village would carry smoke grenades and handheld radios. On tiger contact, infantry immediately popped smoke to cut the tiger's line of sight and radioed the exact position. Tank destroyers would not enter the village. They would be prepositioned at every exit road before the advance began. Artillery would fire white phosphorus to mark the tiger's location from above. P-47S would orbit overhead, not to bomb inside the village, but to track any tiger attempting to withdraw and hit it the moment it reached open ground. Every village became a trap. If a tiger fired from inside a town, it revealed itself, lost its vision to smoke, found its escape routes covered, and had an aircraft watching from above. The ambush predator became the ambush prey. September 15th, the village of Saint-Aubin-les-Thys. 3 streets, 1 church, 2 bridges. A French farmer who had watched 2 tigers drive into barns on the east side of the village the night before and reported it to American scouts. Major Whitfield planned the engagement personally. Infantry entered from the west at 0530, moving in small teams along building walls, marking potential tiger positions with chalk. Tank destroyers positioned at every road leading out. 4 vehicles, 4 exits, no escape. Artillery registered on the village square and eastern approaches. P-47S on standby at 8,000 feet. Eddie's Sherman and 3 others waited 400 yards to the west. They were bait. Their job was to advance slowly along the main road, presenting exactly the target that tiger ambush crews couldn't resist, a column in file, the same formation that had been destroyed at Montclair. Eddie drove. His hands were steady. His mouth was dry. At 6:14, his Sherman reached the first buildings. The street narrowed. Walls rose on both sides, exactly the killing ground a tiger commander would choose. At 06:17, the tiger fired. The round passed 3 feet above Eddie's turret. The shockwave cracked Morrison's periscope. The tiger was in a barn 120 yards ahead, its barrel visible through the barn doors. It had aimed for the turret and pulled high. An 88-millimeter round that missed by 36 inches. Eddie was alive by 36 inches. Morrison was already screaming into the radio. Tiger, barn, east side, 120 yards, Main Street. Everything happened simultaneously. Smoke grenades arced from infantry positions on both sides of the street. White smoke billowed across the road, cutting the tiger's sightlines. The tiger fired again, blind, the round punching through a house wall to Eddie's left and exiting through the roof. Eddie threw the Sherman into reverse and backed out of the kill zone at full speed, tracks grinding on cobblestones. Artillery opened up, not on the barn, but on the roads east of the village, white phosphorus bursting in brilliant white clouds, marking every exit route. P-47S banked hard overhead. Inside the barn, the Tiger crew made their decision. They couldn't see. They couldn't stay. The engine roared, the Tiger crashed through the rear wall and turned east toward the nearest bridge. It never reached the bridge. A tank destroyer from the 704th was hulled down behind a stone wall, 200 yards from the bridge. The Tiger came around a corner at 12 miles an hour with its turret still facing west toward the smoke. The tank destroyer fired twice. Both rounds hit the Tiger's side armor. The first penetrated. The second detonated the ammunition inside the hull. The second Tiger in the village tried to go north. A P-47 pilot tracked it from overhead, radioing its position to a second tank destroyer covering the northern road. The Tiger emerged between two houses into a narrow lane. First round hit the front drive sprocket. The Tiger stopped and sat there, immobilized. 3 of the 4 crew members were captured by infantry within minutes. 2 Tigers engaged, 2 Tigers destroyed or captured, 0 American tanks lost, 0 fatalities. Within 24 hours, the procedure had spread to every company in the regiment. Within 48 hours, it had propagated across the entire 3rd Army sector. The kill ratios tell the story bluntly. In the 3 days before the village trap was implemented, Tiger ambushes destroyed 14 American tanks and killed 37 men. In the 3 days after, American forces destroyed or captured 19 Tigers while losing 5 Shermans. German commanders could feel the shift immediately. Bayerlein's after-action reports from this period, recovered after the war, document growing desperation. His dispersal tactic had worked for barely 48 hours before the Americans adapted around it. Tiger crews began to understand that firing their gun was essentially marking themselves for destruction. Some crews abandoned their Tigers without firing at all, choosing capture over the near certainty of being cornered. By September 18th, 5 days after the first engagement, 67 of the original 92 Tigers were destroyed, captured, abandoned, or immobilized. Of the 25 nominally operational, fuel shortages had reduced that number to perhaps 15 that could actually move and fight. Operation Eisenhammer, Iron Hammer, had not merely failed. It had become a catastrophe, and its reverberations ran far beyond 1 regiment and 1 week in eastern France. Intelligence reports on Patton's anti-Tiger tactics were distributed to every Allied army in the European theater. British forces adopted modified versions within weeks. The psychological damage to German armored forces was profound and lasting. Tiger crews who had entered the war believing themselves essentially invulnerable now understood they were the priority target in a coordinated killing system. German war production records show that by October 1944, field commanders were requesting fewer Tiger replacements, not because Tigers weren't needed, but because commanders had concluded that committing Tigers against Patton's forces meant feeding expensive, irreplaceable machines into a grinder. The myth of the invincible Tiger, the weapon that had terrified Allied armies since North Africa, died in the villages and fields of eastern France in September 1944. Eddie Kowalski received a Bronze Star for his role in the Saint-Aubin-Lety engagement. Morrison's crew went through 4 more Tiger engagements without losing a single man. Major Whitfield was promoted to lieutenant colonel. Colonel Brennan, who had initially tried to stop all of it, received a commendation for the regiment's overall performance. He never directly acknowledged what Eddie had contributed. He didn't need to. The numbers acknowledged it for him. The war, of course, was not over. By December, the Germans would make one last desperate throw. 250,000 men and the last reserves of German armor into the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Eddie's regiment was rushed north. On December 22nd, while repairing a thrown track on an icy road near Bastogne, a German artillery barrage struck the column. Shrapnel from an airburst hit Eddie in the left shoulder and back. Morrison dragged him behind the tank and held field dressings against him until the medics arrived. Eddie survived. He was evacuated to England. In March 1945, 2 months before Germany surrendered, he received a medical discharge and a Purple Heart and went home to Cleveland. He never went back to his uncle's garage. The shoulder injury made working under cars too difficult. He took a job as a quality control inspector at a Ford plant in Brook Park, walking assembly lines and listening to engines. The same instinct that had let him hear a tiger's mechanical weaknesses still working, still useful, now applied to Fords instead of Panzers. He married a woman named Patricia in 1947. They had 3 children. He never talked about the war. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his oil-stained notebook had become something permanent. The combined arms anti-armor tactics that Patton's Third Army crystallized in September 1944 were codified into U.S. Army Field Manual 1733, published in 1946, which explicitly cited the Tiger engagements as case studies in coordinated operations against heavy armor. The manual was updated for Korea, where American forces used nearly identical methods against North Korean T-34s. It evolved through Vietnam with helicopter gunships replacing some of the P-47s. During the Gulf War in 1991, American M1 Abrams tanks used the same core principle: speed, flanking, combined arms, never give the enemy the fight they planned for. To destroy over 3,000 Iraqi armored vehicles in 100 hours while losing fewer than 50 tanks. The tactical DNA ran in a direct line from France in 1944 to Kuwait in 1991. NATO's Cold War doctrine for stopping a Soviet armored advance through the Fulda Gap, the plan called Air-Land Battle, was essentially Patton's 5 principles scaled to a continental level. Over 40 nations adopted variations of it. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst to St. Cyr taught the Tiger engagements as textbook examples of how disciplined tactical thinking defeats technological advantage. Historians estimate that the combined arms doctrine that crystallized in those 72 hours in eastern France has influenced the training of more than 12 million soldiers across the Western Alliance in the 8 decades since. None of that doctrine carried Eddie Kowalski's name. In 1998, a military historian named Dr. Robert Callahan was working through declassified documents from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. In a box, he found a single typewritten page dated October 1944. It was a recommendation from Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield to Third Army Intelligence, proposing that the anti-Tiger tactical procedures developed during Operation Iron Hammer be formalized and attributed to their original source. The name on the document was not Whitfield's, not Hayes's, not Brennan's. It was Corporal Edward J. Kowalski, U.S. Army, and Whitfield's recommendation was that the tactical bulletin be officially designated the Kowalski Protocols. The recommendation was denied. Third Army staff concluded that attributing tactical doctrine to an enlisted mechanic would undermine the authority of commissioned officers. The bulletin was published anonymously as Technical Bulletin 44-17. Eddie's name appeared nowhere. Dr. Callahan tracked down the family. Eddie had died in 1991 at 70 in the same house on East 71st Street in Cleveland, where his mother had received that 4-page penciled letter in November 1944. The letter that described what burning men sound like, and a French girl who was 10 years old, and the only thing that kept him functioning being the engines that had logical solutions, unlike the problems inside his head that had none. His children, 2 daughters and a son, knew he had served in Patton's Third Army. They knew about the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. They did not know about the notebook. In 2003, the Association of the United States Army published Dr. Callahan's research. For the first time, the name Edward Kowalski was publicly connected to the anti-Tiger tactics of September 1944. A small ceremony was held at the Army Heritage Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Eddie's son, Thomas, accepted a posthumous commendation on his father's behalf. Thomas later told a reporter that his father would have been embarrassed by the attention. Dad always said he was just a mechanic who got lucky. He never thought he did anything special. He just looked at the tiger and saw what was broken. That is precisely the point. Eddie didn't see a legendary superweapon. He saw a machine with a turret that took 60 seconds to rotate, an engine that drank fuel like a man dying of thirst, and side armor that a Sherman's gun could reach if you could just get around to the side. The experts in the room saw doctrine and history and strategic context. Eddie saw tolerances and failure modes and breaking points. 92 Tigers were sent to stop Patton. Fewer than 5 made it back. Not because the Sherman was better. Not because America had more factories, though it did. They were destroyed because a mechanic who had never opened a tactical manual understood something that men with 20 years of military education had missed. Every machine breaks. Every weapon has limits. And the side that finds those limits first wins. Eddie Kowalski fixed Chevrolets. Then he helped fix how America fights. He never knew the full extent of what he had done, and that might be the most important part of the story. The people who change history rarely know they're changing it. They're just looking at the problem in front of them, listening carefully, writing it down, and trusting what they hear.